always watching, technology ushers in a new warfare fueled by images and data. Tonight, Spies Above on Spywatch.
This is the Central Intelligence Agency, the hub of American spying. Since its creation in 1947, the agency has been notorious for its covert actions and embarrassing public failures at cloak-and-dagger espionage. But the CIA's most successful spying ring has never been compromised. Since 1960, a small network of secret agents has provided presidents with information that shaped national security policy and quite possibly averted a nuclear apocalypse. These spies never sleep, and they never defect. They are America's powerful photo reconnaissance satellites, the spies in space, and they are the nation's most closely guarded secret. Now, for the first time, the intelligence community has allowed a glimpse beneath the veils of the spies above. Spy satellites are built and operated by a joint CIA Air Force agency called the National Reconnaissance Office. An agency so mysterious that for 32 years even its name was classified.
Baghdad, copy. And this is 100 miles.
From NRO facilities across the world, space spies are steered into position and given their orders. The pictures they take are first seen at the National Photographic Interpretation Center. Every day, imagery analysts search for atomic and chemical weapons, as well as warnings of war. Sometimes they look at photographs. Other times they look at something called soft copy imagery, similar to what you're seeing now. The actual look and feel of today's satellite imagery is a state secret.
These systems are magic, as far as I'm concerned. They are extraordinarily powerful, and I just don't think it makes sense in this era for that information and those technical capabilities to be widely known throughout the world. In an ideal world, there would be no reason for us to protect this information, but it isn't an ideal world.
Satellite now entering target area.
But secrecy won't stop people from guessing. This is Hollywood's best attempt at portraying spy satellites in action. Here, CIA agents watch a British raid on a terrorist camp as it happens, via real-time infrared imagery.
ETA, 35 seconds.
We all rush to those movies to see exactly what they're thinking, because it's always interesting to sort of see, are they leading us or are we leading them? Suffice it to say, we are moving information worldwide very quickly that allows the U.S. to have a very capable intelligence system that's made of land-based, sea-based, and space-based sensors. And if you take all of these kinds of capabilities and put them together, it's something that I think the citizens of the U.S. can be quite proud of.
How real is it? Insiders say the pictures look right, but it's physically impossible for any satellite to hover above a target.
Targets have been neutralized.
Generally, intelligence agents do not watch live feeds from billion-dollar bank surveillance cameras hanging in space. The truth is that imagery analysis is a matter of painstaking detective work. More Sherlock Holmes than James Bond. Most analysts look at pictures through microstereoscopes, searching vast tracts of land for threats to peace and American interests. And the analysts look at everything. Here, a 1970 photo shows gold dredging in Siberia. This image helped the CIA estimate the Soviet Union's economic health. This is what spying is really about. determining the exact strengths and weaknesses of your enemies and your friends. Fortunately for analysts, people are very predictable.
Man lives by custom, practices, and laws. And so if you draw a circle, 25-mile circle, in most areas of the world, man lives and is born, lives, and dies within that circle. And so if you analyze it closely, you can find out what he eats and what he does, and then get an approximate to an idea of how long he lives. And then if you give me comparative coverage, that is, if you give me coverage over a period of time, and then I can look down and I can tell you how many people in a given period by analyzing the graveyards and picking out the new graves.
This is a graveyard of another kind. Here, in the late 1950s, a small team of scientists and secret agents launched the first photo reconnaissance satellite. Using rockets, launch pads, and control rooms originally built to send nuclear missiles streaking into Russia, they created a device that they hoped would prevent an atomic war. The satellite they built was called Corona, and it revolutionized the art of spying.
We were spies, aerial spies. One of the things I wanted to do was position the things so that we weren't carrying armaments. We weren't like a spy with explosives for sabotage. We were like a spy that, unarmed, that gets caught red-handed if we got caught. And there are diplomatic protests galore, but that doesn't blow up international relations. So, but we were a spy. It was a spying effort under international law, and that was the reason for extreme secrecy. That was Eisenhower's main reason.
Space reconnaissance grew directly out of the Cold War race to build nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles. Rockets were expensive and dangerous, but both the U.S. and the USSR realized that if either side controlled the high ground of space, they would have a deadly advantage. In 1954, newly elected President Dwight Eisenhower was told by Air Force intelligence that the USSR was building enormous numbers of long-range bombers and ICBMs, far more than America was building. Unless the U.S. acted fast, the bomber gap and the missile gap would lead to a nuclear Pearl Harbor. But others, including the CIA and the Navy, said the threat was being exaggerated. Facts were hard to come by. The USSR was a huge police state, nearly impossible for human spies to penetrate. Eisenhower tried diplomacy. At a 1955 summit, the president introduced the Open Skies Initiative. Open skies would let the US and the USSR fly over each other's territory. This way, both sides could see if the other was preparing to attack. Soviet Premier Khrushchev flatly rejected the plan. Eisenhower felt he had no choice. If the Soviets would not volunteer strategic information, he would get it illegally. In 1956, he authorized the first flight over Russia by the U-2, a long-range spy plane built by Lockheed and directly controlled by the CIA. It was hoped the plane would fly too fast and too high to be shot down. Using a rundown Washington car dealership as cover, the CIA quietly assembled a small team of experts to analyze the U-2's take. All of the agents had worked with aerial photography during the Second World War, so they had a unique knowledge of the bird's-eye view. Dino Brugioni was one of the first photo interpreters to look inside Mother Russia.
We were determined to prove the value of aerial photography and later satellite photography. We settled in June, and on July 4th, we had the first mission over the Soviet Union come in. So we had to work very fast. July 5th, we had the mission over Moscow. So we made an impact, an impression very, very fast. We looked at the Soviet bomber bases and we couldn't see the number of bombers that supposedly were there. We looked at Leningrad and we could see what the Soviet Navy was doing. So it was an exciting period.
Then, as now, the most important mission was finding and gauging the strength of nuclear weapons. By studying the size of the blast marks shown in this photo, analysts realized that Soviet bombs were much less powerful than the USSR and the US military had claimed. This was not a popular opinion to express.
Here we were saying, in rapid succession, the bomber gap doesn't exist, the missile gap doesn't exist, and we have some doubts about their nuclear capabilities and so forth. So we were at odds with the Air Force and many other organizations that were saying that the Soviets, that a bomber gap had existed and a missile gap had existed and so forth. And we were saying, no, that's not true.
The results of the U-2 flights were kept top secret, but the president found them calming. They had the opposite effect on the Soviets, who saw the illegal flights as a prelude to invasion.
Our understanding of the U-2 program, why you are doing this, why you are violating our airspace. It was one idea, because you are rushing to begin the war. You want to do this even violating. It was the same violations of our airspace by Germans in 1941.
U-2 photos revealed that the Soviet space effort was in many ways ahead of the American space program. At the Baikonur Cosmodrome, Russia was preparing to send the first man-made object into Earth orbit, setting off a national alarm in America.
I was at the White House when Sputnik went up. Initially, Eisenhower didn't think it was of great importance. He thought this was rather inconsequential, and one of his staff referred to it as a grapefruit in space or playing cosmic basketball. Well, within about 24 hours, we got word from all around the country that people didn't look at this facetiously at all. They were deeply shocked and stunned that we were going to be second in getting into space with a satellite. And within 36 hours, I would say Eisenhower had redirected his policy to seeing what we could do to get into the satellite business.
In fact, work on an intelligent satellite was already underway at California's Vandenberg Air Force Base. The same Air Force team that was racing to build ICBMs was also exploring the possibility of using Thor rockets to put reconnaissance satellites into orbit. The program, called WS-117L, was part of the pioneering aerospace effort led by General Bernard Schriever. Until 1957, Schriever had fought a losing battle for satellite funding.
After Sputnik went up, I used to go back and forth to Washington from the West Coast like a shuttlecock, sometimes twice a week, making presentations to the Pentagon. Why can't you go faster? Making presentations to the Congress, congressional committees. Crisis does really speed things up and speeds them up very quickly, because the American people are yelling at the politicians, and the politicians are saying, okay, let's go. Why haven't we been doing it faster before?
Eisenhower brought in the CIA to co-manage a new high-priority reconnaissance satellite. This Spies and Soldiers partnership became formally known as the National Reconnaissance Office.
The CIA did have more flexibility in its procurement policies. It could spend money faster and with less accountability than the Air Force. And that, when you're starting something, that was an advantage, particularly if you're starting late, which we were with the satellite.
WS-117L was officially canceled. The highly classified Corona satellite quietly took its place.
In 1958, I was called into my boss's office, and he basically said, Jim, I'm going to give you a new assignment. He says, we want you to go underground. And he had a covert program, a truly solid need-to-know program that could tell no one. I was only allowed to talk to 2 people in Lockheed, and those were my 2 immediate top bosses. And our job was on a very, very short schedule, maximum risk, complete the design, build it, launch it, and get some film back.
In the late 1950s, rocket launches were too big and too unusual to go unnoticed. So the Corona satellite was hidden in plain sight. A feel-good space exploration project called Discoverer served as the cover story. Since the Thor rocket and the upper stage Agena spacecraft that would carry Corona into orbit were not classified, it was possible to put the entire resources of the aerospace community to work and still maintain near absolute secrecy. Most workers at Vandenberg and Lockheed, like the press, were told that Discoverer was a biomedical research project that would carry mice and monkeys into orbit.
Never was there a piece of paper in our office that said Corona. And never in any conversation in our office was there any mention of the word Corona. We were the Discoverer program. As I say, there were hundreds of people that worked on the program that didn't have a clue that there was a camera on board.
In fact, the Agena spacecraft would eventually hold the first 4 KH or keyhole cameras. This is the KH-4, the only remaining camera used in the Corona program. This later model device, built by iTech Optical Systems, holds 2 cameras and 2 pods of 70mm film. For as rocket power increased, engineers were able to squeeze in more payload. The trick of designing spy satellites is to make cameras light enough to lift, strong enough to survive a launch, and equipped with enough fuel and optical power to make the trip worthwhile. But in the early days of spaceflight, just getting the rocket off the ground was no small feat. Finally, Discoverer 13 was successful from start to finish. It did not carry a Corona camera, but it proved the rocket systems were ready. The breakthrough came just as time for the U-2 had run out.
President Eisenhower was always very worried in authorizing the U-2 program and the overflights of the Soviet Union that they would shoot it down if they could detect it and get a missile or an aircraft up to U-2 altitudes. And unexpectedly, the Soviets tracked the U-2. The radar tracked it continuously from its first flight, but they didn't have the ability to shoot it down until 1960, when they did.
On May 1st, 1960, a U-2 flown by Gary Powers was shot down over Russia. Powers was captured and tried as a spy. Soviet Premier Khrushchev, who had quietly protested the flights for years, publicly excoriated Eisenhower. The president was forced to stop all U-2 overflights of Russia. 3 months later, Powers was sentenced. But on the same day, this very significant headline appeared. Only people with stratospherically high security clearances knew it, but Discoverer 14 was the first successful flight of a spy satellite. The first Corona had enough fuel to make 17 orbits of the Earth. After passing over denied territory 7 times, the satellite ejected a capsule filled with exposed film back down to Earth. Fears were high that Russian submarines might capture Corona capsules if they fell into the ocean, so an audacious plan was formed. Whenever possible, airplanes would snatch the capsules as they dropped from the sky.
I used to give briefings on the Discoverer program, and I'd tell them about how the satellite was going to work and what we were going to do, and we were going to fly mice and monkeys and all that junk. And we had a capsule on board, and that capsule was going to deorbit and it was going to come back to Earth, and it was going to float down on a parachute. Well, the audience, almost without exception, had listened to all this stuff about the satellite and how it was going to do this, that, and they didn't have any problem with that. And then I'd say, and the airplane was going to fly by with a trapeze out at the back, and it's going to catch the capsule and roll it in. And they'd say, hey, you're nuts. That'll never happen. Well, it turned out that was the easiest part of it. The hard part was getting the capsule anywhere near the airplane.
Once recovered, Corona film was rushed to photo interpreters. The first Corona mission covered 1.5 million square miles of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. These are its first grainy images, taken from 100 miles in space. 64 new airfields were found, but no new ICBMs. Over the next year, picture quality improved, and the debates over Soviet strength continued.
The Corona vehicle gave us more than we had ever gotten back from all of the U-2 photography taken, but still it covered only a portion of the Soviet landmass, and we didn't find any missiles in it. About the summer of 1961, you began to firm up the impression that, in fact, there was no missile gap in the sense that the Soviets, as a matter of fact, were not ahead of the United States. In fact, the United States was ahead. But there still persisted to be a difference in views, actually, for some years to come, as to the rate at which the Soviets would deploy missiles in the future.
Corona had taken its first small steps, but by the early 1960s, America's ICBM program had moved out of the experimental phase and into operational readiness. In missile silos like these, small crews sat on doomsday watch, waiting for the command to begin a nuclear war. A new president who had campaigned on a hardline anti-communist ticket had taken office. Having denounced Eisenhower for allowing the USSR to gain the lead in the missile gap, John Kennedy initially refused to believe CIA estimates. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara personally went through the spy photos and discovered there was no missile gap. But missiles would continue to plague Kennedy in the months ahead. A communist revolution in Cuba had given the USSR an opportunity to place strategic bases 90 miles off the coast of Florida, setting the stage for a crisis that proved the value of imaging intelligence.
We had an agent in Cuba that indicated that there was an area in which the Cubans were being moved out and the Russians were being moved in. A mission was flown over the area, and when we looked at the area, that's when we found the missiles. We knew that that was going to hit the president right between the eyeballs. I mean, this was something that they weren't expecting, and that this was something that was going to create a major crisis between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Because of its slow turnaround time, satellite imagery was of little use in this crisis. Policymakers and analysts needed immediate updates and the best possible picture quality. They turned to the U-2 for their imagery. Low-flying missions were ordered, and they revealed the Soviets were shipping in enough portable nuclear weapons to wipe out the East Coast.
In some cases now, the photography was driving the crisis. And in some cases, we were seeing things on photography that the policy people were trying to draft documents to keep up with us as to what the president should do. There was those that said do nothing, and there was a military. The military wanted bombing and invading of Cuba immediately. They felt that the Russians had taken a calculated risk, and we ought to take them up on it.
Kennedy opted for a middle course, a naval blockade of Cuba. The crisis worsened. Hardened nuclear weapons bunkers were found near completion, and photographs proved that the Soviets had 24 missiles ready to fire at U.S. targets. All-out war was at hand, but Kennedy stood his ground. He knew from Corona that in a nuclear showdown, the U.S. had the advantage. Finally, the Soviets backed down. The CIA watched and confirmed that all the missiles scheduled to leave were removed as promised. For the analysts, there was relief and disquiet.
But now keep in mind, you saw what happened at Hiroshima with a 20 kiloton. Okay? You had 1,200 SAC bombers with nuclear weapons. You had 400 ICBMs. You had Polaris submarines at sea with nuclear weapons. You had carriers with nuclear weapons on them that were going to be launched. If we went to war, 70 Russian cities were scheduled for destruction by SAC. So you can imagine if all of this weaponry was launched, what would have happened not only to the Soviet Union, but what would have happened to the world?
The close call of the Cuban Missile Crisis led to better communication between the U.S. and the USSR, but it did not slow down the production of nuclear bombs. In fact, the arms race continued at an even faster pace. This Minuteman III missile silo is one of the 1,000 the U.S. built by 1970. Warheads had become smaller and more capable. One Minuteman now carried 3 mini-missiles, each of which could hit targets hundreds of miles apart with a 375 kiloton blast. To aim its missiles accurately, the U.S. needed precise geodetic coordinates for every point on Earth. Spy satellites provided the means to do this. The Argon, or KH-5 camera, let America map the world for the first time. Data from Corona was then used to figure out exactly where to drop the bombs. And the Soviets were offering plenty of strategic targets. By 1970, they had built 2,200 ICBMs. Space-based reconnaissance was less of a priority.
For us, it was even not the second and the third and not fourth priority, all these photographs. Then military came in one, and of course they told to Khrushchev, Americans will be ahead, they will know everything about us, we have to do the same. So it was signed the decree, the decision of the government, to begin of designing this, and it was order to Korolev.
Sergei Korolev, Russia's chief space designer, was ordered to quickly build a Soviet version of Corona. He pragmatically chose to drop a camera inside the same Vostok pod he had built for the first manned space missions. The spy satellite, codenamed Zenit, was launched in 1962. Its primary task? Gathering geodetic data on the U.S. for accurate targeting of ICBMs. Meanwhile, improvements in rocket boosters and cameras had extended the life of Corona satellites from hours to weeks. Launches continued roughly once a month, with little notice. NASA's manned space program had long since diverted public attention from the mysterious flights at Vandenberg. Slowly but surely, the analysts at NPIC were analyzing and cataloging every strategic threat in the world. The National Intelligence Estimate, an annual report used by policymakers to determine defense spending, was no longer entirely built on guesswork. Corona provided solid facts about military strength, economic health, and social organization. Photo interpreters probably knew more about the inner workings of the USSR than most of its citizens. Interpreters have to be able to recognize thousands of objects from overhead, taking into account the effects of the 32,400 possible angles of the sun on an object. Imagery analysis is still too subjective for computers to be of much help. This mass of scars baffles ordinary viewers, but analysts immediately recognize it as a tank firing range. Analysts also watch changes in key areas over time. This is Russia's Severodinsk shipyard in 1964. 2 submarines are docked in a holding pen. This is the same shipyard in the winter of 1968. The curved markings were made by an icebreaker.
The Soviets had a great penchant for security. And they would secure their installations not with one, but sometimes with as many as 5 fences. So looking down when you're scanning the photography, if you see an installation that's heavily secured, then you analyze it very, very carefully. A missile is a very precious thing. They cost millions of dollars. They're big. And so good roads were constructed, but the roads also had to be constructed with wide radius turns so that you could move the missile about. And so all you had to do was follow these roads with the wide radius turns, and then they would end at a missile silo. The point that I'm trying to make here is that we see things that the groundling is not cognizant of at all when he's doing things on Earth.
The USSR and China knew they were being watched, but they could not be certain how much detail we could see. The Soviets launched a deception campaign with less than spectacular results.
The one that stands out most in my mind was the rubber submarine. There was a replica of a submarine tied up at one of the piers, and there was a considerable storm that blew by. And on the next image we had, this was half deflated and bent in half, and it looked like a submarine that was at right angles with the two parts of it.
Once a month, Corona's latest findings were distributed to the national security community. Spy photos had changed the nature of intelligence and greatly enhanced the credibility of CIA analysts. The biggest impact was felt in the White House. The CIA Operations Center, called the Watch, monitors breaking worldwide events. The Watch combines communication interceptions, human source intelligence, and imagery for its most important function, preparing a daily briefing for the President.
Brand new construction. All of this area in here is new. You can see the fence line that they've already...
Normally a briefer will go in with a structured message. That's so, in effect, you at least know what you're going to say and you won't be wasting a president's time. You may also have some what we call briefing boards, either imagery or maps or diagrams, whatever the topic of the briefing requires. And you'll show these and go through them, but you get a lot of questions, not only from the president, but from everybody sitting around the room. Everybody seems to jump in on these and ask questions and raise issues, and you get a pretty good feel for what kinds of issues concern them, and then you can go back and produce some more analysis that would be supportive of answers to those questions, or you may find out where they're really skeptical about what the intelligence community is telling them.
Photo reconnaissance adds a degree of certainty to intelligence analysis. But the cold truth is that nothing is certain in the realm of human behavior. Pictures don't lie, but people do. And some people, including some American presidents, don't want or can't bear to hear information that contradicts their view of reality. Case in point. President Lyndon Johnson, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and the war in Vietnam. The CIA supported this war, but its view of how successful American military efforts would be differed sharply from the White House. Here, satellite reconnaissance was of little use. The three-layered canopies of Southeast Asian forests were too thick to see through. Large strategic complexes could be located and targeted for attack, but by and large, this war was not fought by conventional armies reliant on heavy industry for tanks and planes.
You just can't bomb people into submission. Let me give you an example of that. The Ho Chi Minh Trail. McNamara was determined that he could break the back of the North Vietnamese coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so there was extensive bombing. McNamara was indicating success. And then we had low altitude missions, and we would look and say, hell no, there's no success. Because we could see Vietnamese with bicycles with two large baskets bringing supplies. We could also see the Vietnam, they were carrying it on their back. And then we could also see where they were using small pack animals. So they were weaving their way through the bomb craters, and although you had intercepted it for a short period of time, the supplies were still moving.
Tension between the intelligence community and the Johnson administration ran high as the war seemed to grow out of control.
They would send over briefers. And so all the briefing material was under my jurisdiction, and I would lay it out. And there was good, bad, and indifferent. Well, they would always take the good. You know, the light at the end of the tunnel. So one day I was really ticked off, and I jumped the colonel, and I said, "Damn it, you're showing information only the good." And he said, "Yeah, I know." And I said, "Damn it, you ought to be giving the president the good and the bad." And he said, "Well," he said, "when we give him the bad, he gets mad as hell."
The best intelligence in the world is useless if policymakers choose to ignore it. But also, every means of intelligence gathering has its flaws. By the late 1960s, the Corona system was showing its weaknesses. Waiting for the film to be recovered, processed, and analyzed was becoming increasingly archaic in an ever faster-paced world. Large armies were now able to move into battle much more quickly than before.
The bigger the delay, the less relevant the imagery was to decision-making, particularly crisis decision-making. And, you know, there's probably no better example than what happened in 1968 with regard to Czechoslovakia. The U.S. imagery satellites shortly before the invasion, or a few weeks before the invasion, sent back images that didn't seem to indicate that the Soviets were about to invade. There was nothing on those images that would lead the U.S. to draw that conclusion.
Well, you don't get angry over that sort of thing. Here is a revolutionary new means of remote sensing, and it has some limitations. But there were other signs of the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and the problem was that there was a great debate of would they or wouldn't they. It was no secret that people were worried. It's no secret that the Soviets were threatening, and it's no secret that troops were gathering. The question of just how extensive and just which ones and so on could not be settled.
Corona was a search satellite. Its wide-angle view with 6-foot resolution was well suited for picking out large objects in vast terrain. But with weapons getting smaller and more sophisticated,
there was a great debate of would they or wouldn't they. It was no secret that people were worried. It's no secret that the Soviets were threatening, and it's no secret that troops were gathering. The question of just how extensive and just which ones and so on could not be settled.
Corona was a search satellite. Its wide-angle view with 6-foot resolution was well suited for picking out large objects in vast terrain. But with weapons getting smaller and more sophisticated, the CIA needed the satellite equivalent of a zoom lens to pick out small details.
I said, go spend some time with the photo interpreters and find out in an analytical, precise way, what resolution do we really need to make the finding of targets a high-confidence process. The report back to me rather confirmed the impression that we had by then reached the natural limits of the Corona camera spacecraft design.
Corona was retired in 1972. Everything that came after it remains classified, but not entirely unknown. Current spy satellites are built and tested here at Lockheed Martin Sunnyvale, California compound. Lockheed has been the prime contractor on virtually every imaging satellite. The current state-of-the-art is the advanced KH-11, which might go by the codename Crystal. Introduced in 1976 and radically upgraded in 1990, it delivers real-time digital imagery via coded signals to Earth. The other cutting-edge imaging system has been called at various times Indigo, Lacrosse, and Vega. Its NASA cousin is the Magellan spacecraft, which mapped the planet Venus. These amazing satellites do not take photographs in the conventional sense. They bounce radar waves off the ground and measure their return time. This information is then run through a computer mapping program that generates three-dimensional views of terrain. Resolution is approximately 1 meter at any time of day, regardless of weather. The advantage of radar imaging is that clouds or darkness make no difference. Interestingly, the Advanced Imaging Laboratory at the CIA, known as Envision, uses similar technology to turn still imagery into three-dimensional real-time terrain maps. This is a simulation of Rosslyn, Virginia. Imagine the possibilities for CIA agents who need to quickly learn the alleyways and bazaars of, say, Baghdad. Today, the National Reconnaissance Office controls at least 4 imaging satellites from its high-security compounds across the United States. But all the technology in the world still can't solve the central riddle of intelligence. What is the other guy thinking?
What's happened over the past years is that the impact of imagery has been such that the debates get shorter and shorter because the imagery that comes in is, in short, fairly persuasive. But Kuwait was one of the last. And there was a debate on whether they would go or not go up until a day or so before the invasion actually took place. Because many countries moved troops to the front, and in this case you knew they moved. But the question is, what is their intention? Are they going to go? Will they invade? And you find many folks that will argue it is not in their interest to invade. It would be a stupid move. And of course, if this were always true and people always recognized it, you'd wonder why so many wars occur.
Inside this germ-free, flag-draped coffin lies Milstar 2. Milstar is not a weapon, nor is it a spy satellite, at least not precisely. It is the second of a planned network of communication satellites that will help field commanders tap into the enormous flow of information generated by space-based sensors. It is suspected that Milstar can access KH-11 imagery and ferry it directly to the battlefield. Milstar reflects the ever-growing hunger for data that has swept the world in the past decade. But the incredible capability of today's imaging systems has reversed the dilemma that faced the intelligence community in the 1950s. Now, instead of having too little information, analysts have far too much to cope with. This is one reason the U.S. does not and cannot monitor everything on Earth all of the time.
It would cost probably around $30 billion alone just for the satellites if we wanted to see everything. We'd also need to spend many more billions of dollars on computer processing, and we'd also have to turn everybody in the country into a part-time imagery interpreter. There's no way with present technology and present limited budgets to see everything.
We're watching things like weapons proliferation, we're watching things like terrorism, we're watching things like narcotics, we're watching a whole shift in the fabric of how societies get together. Ethnic unrest is getting larger. And many of these problems have underpinnings of which information can help sort out what are the viable options for the U.S. The U.S. either as the world's policeman or the U.S. as an informed member of the world community.
Taking pictures from space is a bloodless, blameless business. But once the data passes into human hands, things become far less black and white. Few would dispute the importance of tracking nuclear weapons or looking for signs of war. But at what point does collecting intelligence become a violation of a nation's privacy? When does spying go from passivity to provocation? These questions grow larger as capabilities increase. One thing is certain: if it happens on Earth, it can be seen by the spies above.
Tomorrow, as Spywatch continues, you can't see them, but they are there, recording your every move and even reading your bumper stickers from 70,000 feet above. Paranoia? Well, maybe not. The top secret agenda of spy plane technology is revealed. Tomorrow, as Spywatch continues. And how do spies learn their trade? Where do they find their tools? The answers might surprise you. Log on to www.discovery.com and learn more about the art of surveillance.